The rain in Charleston doesn't just fall, it settles, thick and humid, turning the cobblestones into mirrors of the gas lanterns. I stood in the doorway of Bella Castro's boutique, the bell above the door chiming with a frantic, off-key sound as I stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and old paper, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold numbers I'd been drowning in all day. Bella was behind the counter, her hands steady as she folded a silk scarf, but the faint, rhythmic drumming of her fingers against the glass tabletop betrayed the tension pulling at her. She didn't look up immediately, her focus sharp on the task, and for a moment, I just watched, noticing the way the golden light caught the tired lines around her eyes and the defiant set of her jaw. A formal notice of eviction sat on the counter, the bold red font screaming about a lease violation that felt as flimsy as the paper it was printed on. If I didn't intervene, this sanctuary, this place she'd built with such quiet, fierce intent, would be gutted by morning. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and inevitable. The peace I had spent my life constructing was about to be shattered by a simple, cruel act of bureaucracy. Bella looked up then, her gaze meeting mine with a flicker of vulnerability that she quickly masked behind a polite, professional smile. She was older than me, composed and sharp, yet the weight of the encroaching deadline hung in the air between us like static. I didn't know her well. We were essentially strangers who shared a building. But when she'd appeared in my office earlier that day, the desperation in her voice had been a sharp, jarring note I couldn't ignore. She explained the landlord, Mr. Henderson, was using a loophole in the historical preservation clause to force her out, claiming her renovations were unauthorized, despite the signed permits she had in her file. I stepped closer, my boots muffled by the antique rugs, and laid my laptop on the counter, the screen glowing against the dim room. Henderson was a man who hid behind contracts and cold, faceless denials, relying on the fact that Bella wouldn't have the resources to fight him in court. He was counting on her silence, her exhaustion, and the ticking clock of the notice he'd slapped on her window this afternoon. I tapped a key, pulling up the digital trail of her permits, and saw the hidden timestamps that proved his claim was fraudulent. "You don't have to carry this alone," I said, my voice lower than I intended, the professional distance I usually maintained feeling thin and inadequate. She looked at the screen, then back at me, the surprise in her expression giving way to a weary, profound relief that made the space between us feel suddenly, intensely personal. It was an objective fix, a matter of auditing the paper trail and exposing the lie. But as she leaned in to see the details, the distance I kept out of habit felt like a physical barrier I was struggling to maintain. She asked how I was so certain, and I explained the protocol for verifying municipal filings, my fingers moving across the keys with a precision that was second nature. I was a fixer, a man who navigated the wreckage of other people's greed. But here, the stakes felt fundamentally different. Henderson's attorney had already sent a cease and desist, a move designed to intimidate, but I knew the legal language they'd used was hollow. I pointed to the specific clause in the city's ordinance that protected her, my voice calm, the technical reality of the solution grounding the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the shop had shifted from a place of business to a trench in a war we were fighting on paper. I spent hours in the corner of her boutique, my laptop balanced on an antique desk, dissecting Henderson's previous litigation history, while Bella worked around me. She was a woman of habit, the way she arranged the display tables, the way she checked the front door lock twice, and I found myself memorizing these small, grounded rituals. One evening, as the rain turned into a deluge, she walked over and placed a cup of tea by my hand, the steam curling into the cool air. She didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, her presence a silent acknowledgement of the work I was doing. My hands were in my pockets, the instinct to bridge the gap and touch her shoulder rising. But I forced the urge down, keeping my posture rigid. I was the fixer, the man who brought order to her chaos, and I had to remain the steady ground she needed to navigate this, not the complication. She turned back to her work, and I watched her, the simple, honest grace of her movements making it harder to remember why I kept myself so removed from the world. The tension escalated when Henderson showed up at the boutique, his suit too expensive and his attitude overtly dismissive. He walked around the shop as if he already owned the inventory, his eyes scanning the shelves with a predator's disinterest. Bella stood her ground, her back straight, but I could see the tremor in her hands. I didn't get up, but I closed my laptop with a soft, final click that seemed to echo in the room. When Henderson turned to her, his voice dripping with false concern, I stepped between them, my presence a physical weight that forced him to pause. I didn't raise my voice. I simply recited the specific ordinance numbers he had violated and informed him that the state's historical board had already been notified of his interference. The color drained from his face, his arrogance crumbling as he realized I wasn't just a consultant, but a man who had dismantled larger men than him in courtrooms across the state. He tried to bluff, to deflect, but I simply pointed toward the door, my gaze steady and unyielding. He left with a muttered threat, but the leverage he'd held, the fear, had evaporated the moment I'd anchored the truth in public, verifiable fact. The midpoint twist arrived in the form of a certified letter from the city, informing us that the boutique's permit had been suspended pending a secondary review. An administrative move that smelled of Henderson's influence in the city council. We were back to square one, the time cushion we thought we'd gained completely wiped out. Bella sat in the middle of the shop floor, the light fading into a deep, bruised purple, and for the first time, I saw her break. She didn't cry, but she pressed her palms into her eyes, the silence in the room feeling like a vacuum. I walked over and sat on the floor beside her, not touching, just existing in the space where the world had suddenly, cruelly narrowed. She whispered that maybe she should just leave, that the struggle was eroding everything she had left, and I realized then how much she had been sacrificing to maintain this front. I told her the truth, that the suspension was a common intimidation tactic, and that I had already initiated a private meeting with the planning director, a man I'd helped once before. She looked at me, really looked at me, and in that moment, the restraint I had built around myself fractured. I reached out, my hand hovering, then finally, firmly settling on her shoulder, a grounding wire for the storm she was experiencing. The following days were a blur of logistics, phone calls, and late nights spent in the shop. The pressure was constant, a low-level hum in the background of everything we did. One night, I found her sleeping in the small office chair, a ledger open on her lap. I moved quietly, grabbing a wool coat from the rack and tucking it around her shoulders. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and for a heartbeat, we were just two people existing in the quiet. The rest of the world and Henderson's machinations miles away. She looked at me, her expression soft and unguarded, and I stepped back, the duty to protect her from this fight battling with the overwhelming desire to simply stay in that moment of stillness. I had to stay sharp, to keep the audit moving toward our favor, so I retreated to the counter, opening my laptop again. She watched me, a small, knowing smile touching her lips, and it was the most terrifying, rewarding look I'd ever received. I knew that when this was over, I would have to navigate the truth of what we were becoming. But for now, the only thing that mattered was securing the keys to her future. The hearing was held in a stark, wood-paneled room that felt 1,000 miles removed from the warmth of the boutique. Henderson sat at the table opposite us, his confidence bolstered by a team of lawyers, while I had only a stack of folders and the truth. When the board opened the floor, I didn't use flowery language. I spoke in data, in timelines, and in the concrete reality of the fraudulent signatures Henderson had submitted. I showed them the original blueprints, the permits, and the correspondence that proved he had been acting in bad faith. Bella sat beside me, her presence an anchor that kept me focused, her eyes never leaving the board members. When the judge finally asked if Henderson had anything to add, he was silent, his gaze fixed on the table. The decision was rendered within the hour. The lease was valid, the renovation was cleared, and Henderson was ordered to pay for the lost business time. It wasn't the dramatic climax of a movie. It was a quiet, precise victory, the kind that held up under scrutiny and time. After the hearing, we walked out into the Charleston air, the humidity broken by a cool evening breeze. The relief was a tangible thing, a heavy weight that had finally been lifted from our shoulders. We stopped on the steps of the courthouse, the city moving around us, completely unaware of the battles we had just won. I looked at Bella, her face lit by the orange glow of the street lamp, and I realized that the void I had carried for years, the feeling that everything was just a transaction, had been replaced by the absolute, grounding certainty of this moment. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of my coat, and the hesitation that had defined our relationship for weeks finally dissolved. I didn't need to be the fixer anymore. I just needed to be the man who was standing next to her. She looked at me and asked what we were going to do now, her voice clear and without a trace of the fear that had defined our first meeting. We walked back to the boutique, the bell chiming as we entered, and I felt the air shift, the space no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary. Bella turned to me in the center of the store, the racks of silk and lace surrounding us, and she took my hand, not as a client, but as an equal. I leaned in, the distance I had meticulously maintained finally closing, and I sealed the promise of our future with a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like an arrival. It was soft, absolute, and grounding, a finality that locked everything into place. She introduced me to Leo, her store manager, who had been waiting for news, and the way she said my name, the way she claimed me in front of him, made the victory in the courtroom feel like a mere prelude. I handed her the updated lease papers, signed and notarized, the practical proof of our success, and she accepted them with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. I had spent my life fixing things for people I didn't know, but this was the first time I had built something that was truly mine to keep. Closing thoughts. Real love isn't about the grand gestures or the drama. It's about the consistency of showing up when things are hard. It's the safety you build together, stone by stone, until the world doesn't feel so overwhelming anymore. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. The end.